Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, I have a very special guest with us. This is Paul Ellis, someone of whom is quite well known for his Jerusalem thesis, which calls into question the standard Islamic narrative that we have for the origins of Islam, exactly how it started, how does the Quran make sense given its historical presence, how do we all put that together? Paul Ellis has his own understanding, his own theory that we're going to be talking about today. And I guess what I would like to do is just to start off by saying, Paul, how did you get into this? Like, how did this become interesting? What first got you motivated to look into this?
Hi. Well, thank you very much for having me on your channel, Chris.
No worries.
Some years ago, probably I don't know, around about 2015, 2016, I became very concerned about Islam and the reality of Islam. In the lived Islamic experience and what that means to society that is modeled on Islamic principles. And I started from a somewhat polemical point of view. One has these very negative ideas of what a Muslim might be like, the jihadi, the grooming gang, the honor killer, and so on. And wants not to take this as a stereotype and just tar all Muslims with it. But the reality is that when one looks into the Quran, one finds ample material for these negative role models or role actors, and one sees very little in the Quran that is about love thy neighbor and let's all get along together, that sort of thing. So I started off with a fairly somewhat shocked that this book, the Quran, was full of all this mother load of bad stuff.
I had the same experience, just to jump in there, when I first read the Quran. Saw just exactly all these things, and I couldn't quite believe that what I was reading.
And it's quite easy to go online and find other polemicists, other people with long lists of all the worst bits of the Quran. Slay the infidel wherever you find them. Take their sword to their neck, chop off their fingertips, this sort of thing. But then you read it, and whereas coming from a Christian background, one somehow assumes, well, there's going to be lots of bad bits in the Quran, but also going to be lots of good bits as well. There really aren't. It really is very, very one-sided towards a martial, punitive, obedience-orientated society with arbitrary rules, often quite illogical rules, enforced by brutal punishments. And what one might look for in terms of love thy neighbor simply isn't there. Or if it is there, you have to really stretch quotations. There's not much. It's not.
You won't find much in the way to actually support that.
No. So that was my point of view when I went into it. And then, of course, you say, well, you've got to read it in context. So then you're sort of reading the life of Muhammad, and everything that is in the Quran seems 10 times worse in the life of Muhammad. If they say, well, crucify people or expel them or behead them or chop their limbs off, and you find Muhammad says, oh, well, let's gouge their eyes out as well. You get everything that seems to be bad in the Quran always seems to be worse with the life of Muhammad. You really struggle. I put a challenge to any Muslim to say, find me any instance where Muhammad says or does anything nice that would be recognized by a non-Muslim as being a nice thing. You could say he's a prophet of God. You could say that he was chosen by God and he did God's will, if that's what you believe God's will is. But to find anything that he does that would be laudatory from a non-Muslim perspective, it really is very, very little there. So that was how I started off into this. However, in 2018, there was a conference in London, and it was held by some of the leading scholars on Islam. It took place over 2 days, and I'm not quite sure how I found out about it. Came across it on the internet. It cost something or nothing. It was like sort of £40 or £50 to sign up for this 2-day conference, and I didn't really know who anybody was there. I now look back on the list of speakers, and it's incredible. Some of the real leading scholars on Islam in the world today.
Can you give us some names?
Yeah, Gabriel Said Reynolds was there, the author of the Quran and the Bible, a real expert in the biblical allusions in the Quran. Sean W. Anthony was there. I sat two seats down from Stephen Shoemaker, who wrote Death of a Prophet, and he was at that stage had only recently published about the Church of his work on the Church of the Katisma. So he's very interested in that. There were other people. Holger Zellentin was there. Many of these great people, and they were stood up there, and they each spoke for slightly less than an hour, and for 2 days I was just in the presence of greatness, and I had no idea who any of these people were. You know, what I would do to go back there now, and so many questions to ask them. But what I did leave there knowing was that the Quran is hugely complex, and there is real depth of meaning. You know enough to know that there is a great wealth of structure and subtlety in the Quran, and yet there's almost nothing about which any of these great people could say to have, or all of them could say to have reached a consensus about. They seem completely, if you asked any of them, so how did the Quran get written? You wouldn't really have much of an answer. They all are experts in their own little areas, but they don't, none of it really amounts to a theory. None of it amounts to an explanation as to the geographical area, the time, the confessional background of Muhammad. Was he a Jew? Was he a Christian? You have all these huge uncertainties, and yet you have this tremendously fantastic problem. So that was 2018. It's now 4 years later, and for much of the last 4 years, not too much the last year, but for certainly 2 or 3 years, I was reading books and articles pretty much every day on the Quran, trying to figure it out. This bizarre situation that we now find ourselves in the world, where we have to answer this ancient riddle in order to save society moving forward.
I think that's a really good way you put it there, because I was thinking how much the Quran is kind of like a Rubik's Cube, a logic puzzle, because there's so much in it that seems to have some meaning, some objectivity. It has an intended audience. It has an author of whom had something in mind, and yet it's so without context, without framing. It's just so standalone. Pieces don't work with other pieces. Some pieces of some surahs were written earlier and others later, and some scholars think that some were added at a later point. And it screams out for a rational thesis that just takes account all of this and can give it in a rational way that doesn't just account for, rely on Islamic narrative, right? Because one thing that I'm guessing the people that you mentioned, Sean Anthony, Gabriel Reynolds, Stephen Shoemaker, they probably would have more of a skeptical side on. They would perhaps be willing to poke the Islamic narrative more than other scholars might be. And I think that's probably the correct approach, because from what I know, having read your thesis and having heard some of the things elsewhere that touch on the same kind of points, is that there are holes in the narrative, in that there are parts of the narrative that we know simply are not correct, that they have problems with them. And for me, that has always been most profound when you look at the fact that we have references to Muhammad from independent authors who had no reason to make this stuff up. They claimed that there is someone by that name in what is now Palestine, what is Syria, Jerusalem area. Mm-hmm. And that to me seems, wow. That's recorded at least 2 years after supposedly he died. So he supposedly died 632. He's being referenced in 634. That's crazy, because that immediately changes the whole timeline, right? So the Islamic narrative would say Muhammad died in 632, and then you had Abu Bakr, who did for this long, and then after that you had Umar or Uthman, and he starts to go on with the caliphs. But if Muhammad didn't die when he supposedly died, then all of a sudden it doesn't just change the story about what happened historically about Muhammad, but of the caliphs as well, which is huge because that has knock-on effects for everything. And that for me is, if you can't even know for sure when he died and when others started reigning, then there is huge gaps in this narrative that we haven't explored yet, that we have so much scope to learn about and to question. And from what I'm seeing with your thesis and with the work of others, is we're starting to now prod that historically. We're using historically critical methods to be able to evaluate these things and to get a much more rich understanding. Is that
Yes.
fair? Does that sound about right?
Absolutely. There's a real need to understand this. The narrative, I was talking a little bit about the negative aspects of the character Muhammad as he's presented. And the positive side is that I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe that Muhammad ever did any of the things. I don't think that the Quran was written by a guy who went out and robbed caravans and murdered poets and poetesses. And I don't think he ever murdered, tortured a guy in order to find out where his gold had been hidden. I just don't think any of these things ever happened at all. I think Muslims should be queuing up to, they had any sense of queuing up to supporters, because I'm sure that the real Muhammad would have been a very, very different character to the absolute nightmare figure that people present in the literature. And that raises the question: where did the story come from? Because it seems to me quite clear that it's not an exaggeration. These aren't pious accretions of one person making up a story around the campfire and then somebody else exaggerating and somebody passing it on and somebody mishearing anything. No, it seems to me quite clear that there is a lie here, a huge fundamental lie that was told at some stage in the 1st century and which has dominated Islam to this day. And we can show that the traditional narrative doesn't make sense. It's not uncorroborated by any evidence at all. It doesn't make any sense and doesn't actually explain the Quran. When one reads the Quran, there is an explanation there, but it doesn't. It's nothing to do with Mecca, and it's nothing to do with robbing caravans.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be what I'm finding more of. And you're right. I think you will be hard pushed to find complementary descriptions in the Quran. I mean, one of the problems we both know is that Muhammad is only mentioned directly by name in the Quran 4 times, and the scholars have been questioning whether those actual references are sound to be thinking of a person called Muhammad, or whether or not it's a reference to Jesus, for example, mainly because Muhammad can mean the praised one or the blessed one. Yeah, and I think a lot of the stuff that is positive, because I have found things that are positive in all fairness, but they're also they come many years later. They come from the hadith that has been, according to the authors of it, incredibly selective. I mean, you look at Bukhari, he made it absolutely clear that he had, I think it was hundreds of thousands of hadith, and he intentionally lowered them to about 7,000 or so. Mm-hmm. And when you have that kind of self-admission, you're saying, well, whatever he left, the things that are positive, they're hand-picked positive things, at least. You know, you have to be very skeptical about how authoritative that is, and you're just taking it on Bukhari's word, ultimately. So I have problems from it from that point of view. One of the things, you kind of touched on it, when you said that you don't think any of this happened, like you don't think that there was this person called Muhammad who went and did these things that are described. One thing I've been wondering is, what is your understanding of the Quran as a whole? Do you think the Quran is, what, in effect, something that pre-existed before the time that we have the manuscripts, for example, say the 7th century? Do you think there are parts of it that come before the 7th century, either in text or just as a message, in which have been borrowed in order to make something new, to serve a purpose, an objective? I don't know, like, or would you say something different about the origins of the Quran? Like, because to me, it doesn't seem as if it's fully coherent. There seems to be parts that have been borrowed with purposes, and this seems to me to be present in things where it references, so you could say, like Gnostic sources. Or when you look at the miracles of Jesus, for example, they seem to have been borrowed to justify some intent later on, and that's kind of how I see it. And the fact that it's very doesn't flow, like if you compare it to things like the Torah, the Tanakh, the New Testament, it flows with a sequence. You understand where something begins, where something ends, and it's clearly defined. But when you look at the Quran, you don't have that. Things jump, assumably, from one thing to something totally different in a very like sudden and abrupt way. Does that kind of ring true to you, or like, is there anything you want to comment about?
Yes,
that?
I sense that the Quran is the first major text that was composed in the Arabic language. I'm not sure what the second one was, but it is often said that the second or the first Islamic book after the Quran was the Abu Hanifa's law book.
Oh no, different one. Okay.
No, I think is it Atal. I have it in my bookcase behind me, but that would have been after the Abbasid Revolution. So that would have been like 120 years later. So for 120 years, you've got this compendium of texts that seem to have stood alone in terms of Arabic literature. One has poetry as well, but we don't really know. We can't be certain whether the poetry came after the Quran or before the Quran, or one doesn't really know because it was oral. It wasn't written down. So my feeling is that there is a coherence about the Quran. I can't say that I could demonstrate that some bits weren't earlier. I think particularly the last two surahs, 113 and 114, they seem to me to jar. They don't seem to me that I can feel they're the same author who wrote the rest of it. And some bits may come later. So Surah 1 may well have come after Muhammad's death, and the early part of Surah 9, I suggest, comes after Muhammad's death. But overall, I think there is it seems such a unique text with nothing really before, nothing really after that we can really point to. And I see the same, some of the same literary devices occurring time and time again, sometimes the very same words and phrases coming. And so I tend to take the view that most of it probably is one person's work.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Okay, I've always had this. For me, it always seemed as if there were multiple authors who were all being borrowed from to achieve some aim. But I'd be more than welcome to see evidence to suggest otherwise. I'm open to that idea.
And sometimes the Quran has a very distinctive take on things. So as it goes on, as we move towards the more recent surahs, the Medinan surahs, so-called, they become more and more focused on the figure of the messenger, the figure of the prophet. It's hardly there. In fact, he's not there at all in the very early short surahs. And then he becomes hinted at, and then he seems to emerge. And by the later surahs, the primary theme of the Quran is how everybody should be obedient to the prophet, and they should submit their disputes to him. They should follow him in all things. And it becomes Allah and his messenger. It is just like rolled into one, as though it's one single entity. And there was somebody there. There was somebody who that was written by, and somebody who was written about, and this person emerges from the text as it comes along, in my view.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I think it would be a good opportunity for you to just give a summary of your thesis. I know you've got your presentation prepared with animations, and I will bring that up now.
Right, well, I'll start off with a reference here to where my article is, if anyone wants to read it. It's called Jerusalem, City of Islam, and it's on the academia page. I'm actually in the process of rewriting it at the moment and correcting some matters and adding some more detail. But this is where it's available for anyone to read. Okay, my essential thesis is that there is a place within the Quran that goes by various names. It's sometimes called Masjid, al-haram, the sacred place of worship. Sometimes it is called the house, or the sacred house, the ancient house. On 2 occasions, it is called my house in the divine voice, as though God is referring to it as his house. And I would argue that that is strong evidence for it to be associated with the Jerusalem temple. It's also called the Maqam Ibrahim, and finally it's referred to as the cube. Now, this is a place that was, according to the Quran, built on foundations that had been raised by Abraham and Ishmael. It was the destination of a pilgrimage that the Quran refers to as the Hajj pilgrimage. It was the departure point for a mysterious night journey that went from the Masjid al-Haram to a different masjid called the Masjid al-Aqsa, the furthest place of worship. And crucially, it is a place from which the Quranic community had been expelled. Believers are instructed within the Quran to face towards this place whenever they pray. They are told to make the Hajj pilgrimage there if they are able to do so. And they're instructed in Surah 2 and in Surah 22 to fight to regain access to the place from which they have been expelled, and indeed to expel their enemies from it. And this fight appears to have been successful, because in Surah 9, which is the final surah, or what is often regarded as the last full surah to have been announced, the Quranic community appear to be in control of the Masjid al-Haram. They talk about organizing pilgrimages there, and they talk about providing services for pilgrims, and they sign a treaty there, and they expel their enemies from there, and on pain of death. Now, the traditional narrative is that this place refers to Mecca in the Hijaz, this ancient trading post and pilgrimage destination right down there in the Arabian Peninsula. This, I think, has now lost all real credibility. There is no known reference to a place called Mecca prior to the Quran. Even after the people from Mecca have established a great empire and seized such centers of learning as Damascus and Jerusalem and Alexandria and Ctesiphon, nevertheless, people continue to have doubt about where Mecca is for 100 years afterwards. A geography of Ananias say that Mecca is in Paran somewhere. The Arab Byzantine Chronicle says that Mecca is on the banks of the Tigris. So to me, there's simply no way that a group of people from Mecca could have taken over the known world, and 100 years later, everyone still can't work out where Mecca is. There's no clear reference to Mecca in Hijaz prior to 750, which is 120 years, and possibly more importantly, 4 civil wars fought within the Arab conquests. So if by the time you've had all these wars, it seems to be that the waters have become very, very muddied, and that's when Mecca seems to emerge as in the Hijaz as the place, but it's never mentioned clearly prior to 750. There's no physical evidence that's ever been discovered at Mecca prior to Ottoman times. I understand that there is a museum at Mecca, which the earliest exhibit that they have is from the Ottomans. They've never found a coin. They've never found a shard of pottery. They've found absolutely nothing to suggest that there was ever an ancient trading place on the site. And obviously no buildings have been preserved. All the places that one might have thought that they would have said, well, this is where Muhammad was born, this is where Muhammad lived with Khadija, this is where Muhammad did this is where this story might have happened. Nothing has been preserved whatsoever. There's no physical evidence that this ever existed at all.
Just a quick question about that. According to the Islamic narrative, would we expect there to be prominence at Mecca? Would we expect there to be good numbers of people at Mecca?
Oh, well, I think so. It is portrayed as a trading, as a lively trading hub, and people are portrayed as coming there on pilgrimage. So the Muhammad's followers from Medina are all making the annual hard pilgrimage to the Kaaba, supposedly. Okay, but when Muhammad is attacking later on, when Muhammad is based in Yathrib and he's attacking Meccan caravans, Mecca is apparently able to put out an army of 10,000 people, and this army is prepared to march hundreds of miles, and the Medinans have to build this huge trench around their settlement to protect them from it. So it sounds like it's a serious place. It's the sort of place where one would expect, and of course, immediately that Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman set up the Arabic empire, what's now regarded as the Islamic Empire, the Rashidun Caliphate. One would have expected interest in Mecca to have been sparked immediately on that. You would have thought there would be a host of travelers coming down there, having a look around, finding out where this book, the Quran, came from. But there just seems to be no evidence of anyone taking the slightest interest in it for the next 100 years. Wow. Makes you rather wonder why Muhammad was so determined to capture it in the first place, when you see how little interest there is.
There's all sorts of questions that just sparks the mind. I think it's the worst of two extremes. On the one end, it's meant to be able to sustain large groups of people and be very important. On the other end, it must have absolutely have done that because it's meant to be, the Masjid al-haram. It's meant to be the Kaaba. It's meant to be this holy site that was well known for a long periods of time. So it must have been visited, and I think that's just but there's absolutely no way that would have been feasible.
And within the narrative, there's no Muhammad captures Mecca. He then comes back and makes a final pilgrimage there, but he goes back to Yathrib, having seized it. He doesn't settle there. He doesn't make it a center of operation. This great 10-year quest to capture the Kaaba, and nothing really happens thereafter. There's no legal school is set up in Mecca in the same way that you have legal schools in Basra or Medina. There's no textual tradition there in terms of making Qurans in the same way, again, as you have the Medinan Qurans and the Basran Qurans. It just seems
that's really interesting.
It's completely overlooked, and it's hard to imagine that the Prophet of God spent half of his ministry trying to capture this place, and then nobody afterwards really takes any real interest in it.
What I do know from, I think it was Mel from Sneakers Corner, Mel. Or Islamic Origins now. He did something looking into the feasibility of the Zamzam well, and for that to provide enough water to sustain certain populations. What I found really interesting was I think there's a queen, Queen Zubaydah, I think, from what is now modern day Iran, that actually built, I think it's like aqueducts to try and give supplies to Mecca, to give support to pilgrims who are making their way to Mecca. But this happens at the very end of the 8th century, at the beginning of the 9th century. So you still have this massive gap. And that just seems to me just to be saying, well, eventually there were these people who were considering get our holy site. But this happened much later, 150 years later or so on, something like that. Yeah, and I find that just fascinating.
Anyway, so no physical evidence of Mecca. Patricia Crone wrote a very well-known, very famous book in our circles called the. I said that, I forgot what it's called now.
Is it like Meccan Trade?
The Meccan Trade.
Something like that, yeah.
Yes, and it's a very, very famous book, and it's and she demonstrates it couldn't have existed. That no trading center could possibly. It's not on a trade route from anywhere to anywhere. It simply doesn't make sense that somebody would have a big trading hub in this little depression in a valley amongst the mountains. It would just take so long for anyone to go there, and there's no reason. There's simply no reason for anyone to go there. You couldn't even say that they stop for refreshments because the Zamzam well was so meager. There'd be no great vegetation there. There simply is no reason for anyone to go there. Mecca's aridity is inconsistent with the descriptions in the Quran and of the climate and the agriculture of its first audience. And the Quran makes these statements that God's sign, a sign of God in his is in the water that he sends down in abundance, and he talks to people. The Quran to its audience says to take a look at these great fields densely packed with grain. Look at these gardens with trellises. Look at pomegranates and then it talks about your cattle. It says your cattle are beautiful, and in them you find good things when you take them out to pasture and when you bring them back in the evenings. And you're not going to pasture any cattle in Mecca. You're not going to grow any pomegranates in Mecca. This is incredible. In fact, it occurs to me that if one imagines that the Quran's first audience being bombarding its author with questions about the jinn or about fish coming back to life or these mystical stories, but they might equally ask the Muhammad, what is a river, or what is a pomegranate?
Yeah, or an olive.
What are pigs that we shouldn't eat them? Who's going to eat pigs in Mecca? Where's the pigs going to come from? And so the whole tenor of the Quran simply does not, in my view, make sense in such an arid, one of the most inhospitable, barren points on the Earth's surface.
I want to add a little bit to this because you mentioned it in your thesis, and I think this one is just kind of comical as well. There's a verse in the Quran that talks about the abundance of rainfall or the abundance of, and I just thought the abundance. It's such a strange thing to think about in Mecca. I mean, Mecca has in that area, there's an entire month where there just isn't any rain. So it would seem odd to refer to it as an abundance of rain. Surely people would have said, Muhammad, are you sure it's an abundance? Because there isn't too much of it, and I'm surely they would have heard at least of other places where there was more rain. So it's kind of strange for it to be targeted to them in that way.
It's very it's a very ambitious line for a preacher to say that that what I'm saying is true because look around at the abundance of water. One imagines the Meccans looking around and being very underwhelmed by this argument.
But also, I mean, it's the double-edged sword because there's that, but also the Quran verses end it by saying, "And this is a sign from your Lord," or "This is a sign from Allah." So, in other words, if you want to believe in Allah, here are the signs. So, in other words, one of the greatest ways you can know this
I would have chosen sunshine.
Yeah.
Look at the beautiful cloudless skies. That would be a better side.
Very odd.
Okay. Doesn't fit biblical references. So one perhaps comes to assume, and perhaps we shouldn't assume, that the Muslims have to shoehorn people like Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael into the Meccan landscape. But how on earth did Abraham get down there? Why would he have taken Ishmael and Hagar to Mecca, then gone back to Canaan, and then come down on possibly two further occasions and building the Kaaba? Again, it just doesn't fit. It's outside the biblical landscape. It was just too far. You would have to create a completely unrealistic, implausible story for that to work. There's simply no biblical references in no biblical. The story doesn't, but the Bible story just doesn't go that far down.
Yeah.
And oh yes, a single reference to Mecca within the Quran, so 48:24, implies that it's a geographical feature. It doesn't mention a settlement. It talks about the valley of Mecca, and it suggests that it's a place that is on the way to the Masjid al-Haram. There's nothing in that reference to make one think that this is the place that Muhammad is fighting over, or that this is his base, or this is his hometown, or somewhere important. The only reference to Mecca in the Quran simply doesn't carry that amount of importance. It seems to be a place where a treaty is made, and that's it. It's never given any more credence than that.
Interesting.
So let us lose the traditional narrative, and this is where I think it is all about. I say that if the Masjid al-Haram, the holy place of prostration, is Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the holy place of worship in the Bible, right the way through the Bible, almost entirely through the Bible, from the book of Genesis through to the book of Revelation. It's all about Jerusalem. If you ask any biblical character, where's a holy place of worship, pound for a penny, they would say Jerusalem. The Quran borrows so much of these biblical stories, biblical language, biblical characters, biblical turns of phrase. It seems to me that this is the obvious solution. It is the Masjid al-Haram. The Jerusalem skyline, as it is at the moment, is dominated, of course, by the Dome of the Rock, which is built upon the old Temple Mount. But if one looks inside the Dome of the Rock, we find the rock. And this is the same rock that the Jerusalem Temple was originally built around and built upon. And this is in biblical tradition, where Abraham had been prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now, that is part of the covenant that Abraham made with God for his progeny, and this was, of course, fulfilled many generations later when Moses led the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt, and they wandered in the desert, and they had the Ark of the Covenant containing the Ten Commandments. And when they build a temple, they put the Ark of the Covenant inside the temple. And so the place where Abraham had sealed his covenant with God in Genesis becomes the very same rock in which the state of Judah was centered around later on, with this great temple that was built by Solomon, and Solomon puts the Ark of the Covenant into the temple.
Yeah,
it seems to me that this is very much a candidate for being the holy place of worship, not some place that no one's ever heard of down on the Arabian Peninsula. The Ark of the Covenant is, of course, lost, possibly during the Babylonian captivity. We don't know. We don't know for certain. But the temple continues to be the focus for Israelite prayer, for Jewish prayer, and even in the New Testament, there are still references to the holiness of the temple. Zechariah is said to minister before God at the temple. Jesus is taken to the temple as a child to be presented before God, and Jesus quotes from the Psalm. I'm afraid I forget which Psalm, you'll have to remind me, where he says, my house, meaning God's house, should be a house of prayer. And of course, the Jerusalem temple is where it's all expected to end. That's where Jesus will return down onto the Mount of Olives and then return into the temple again. And this is what Christians expect to happen on the biblical story. And it seems to me that this is what the very similar imagery and language that is used in the Quran, perhaps most strikingly with the Valley of Gehenna, which is a valley that is next to the Jerusalem temple, and which the Quran adopts as its name for hell, Jahannam. So the Quran, when it calls hell Jahannam after the Jerusalem Valley of Gehenna, it seems that the Quran is very specifically adopting Jerusalem as its eschatological landscape.
Interesting.
Right. Well, I won't go through them all, but here is a selection of some of the arguments that I present in favor of the Jerusalem thesis. The centrality of Jerusalem to the centrality of Jerusalem to the Bible story, and the prevalence of biblical allusions in the Quran is, I think, quite a dominant one. The eschatological landscape I have mentioned, the Sakina. The idea that the Masjid al-Haram is described as God's house, my house, in the divine voice. It seems to me that that's making it somewhere very special. It's not simply a place of worship. It's not simply a shrine. It is somewhere where God lives, somewhere where God
God dwells, his dwelling place.
And ample references in the Bible to Jerusalem being God, Jerusalem temple as being the house of God. Even within the Quranic, the traditional Islamic narrative, I can't see how anyone could argue that the Kaaba was the house of God. It simply does not. At no stage does anything happen in relation to the Kaaba that might make one think that that was the place that God is uniquely present.
That's a really good point. There just isn't that kind of history that Jerusalem has. It's just vastly barren in comparison. So giving it such a title would just seem very misplaced.
Mm-hmm. And the Quran seems to buy into this, because the Quran talks about the Sakina is or Shekinah is a rabbinic term for the presence of God in various contexts, but including within the Ark of the Covenant. And the Quran accepts that the Shekinah, or the Sakina in the Arabic cognate, it accepts that the Sakina is present within the Ark of the Covenant. And then it also talks about Mary, the mother of Jesus, as being raised in the temple and in the central place, and the conception of Jesus when the angel of God blows the Spirit of God into Mary's womb, all takes place within the Jerusalem temple. It just seems to me so obvious that this is the place that the Quran is talking about as being the sacred place of worship.
Yeah, and what sort of adds to that a little bit for me is the fact that these stories that you mentioned, some of them. So, for example, I think it's the Proto-Evangelion of James, which gives this account of Mary's early life. And it seems, if I remember correctly, there are elements of that seem borrowed from the Quranic, borrowed and found themselves inserted into the Quranic text. So even the sources that I think the Quran is borrowing from are all still centered around this place. It's just giving additional context or stories or ways of further understanding a biblical narrative, and the Quran makes use of it without any concern or issue. Yeah, I find that quite interesting.
Yes, there's never any sense in the Quran that this is that its audience or live somewhere different to the place that it's talking about. It never says, "Oh, all these things happen in Jerusalem, but this is now down in Mecca, and this is a different house of God, or this is a new house of God, or that wasn't the real house of God. This is the real house of God." There's never any sense of what Yuri Rubin calls what do they call it? A sacred axis, a sacred axis with 2 points on. There's never any sense in the Quran that there are 2 holy places, or 1 holy place and a less holy place. Everything seems to say, "Oh, this is about Jerusalem. This is about Jerusalem. This is about Jerusalem," and you really need to believe that the holy place of worship is actually somewhere completely different.
I find this very prominent in Surah 17, and I think you outline it quite well in your thesis when you say, if you look at just the first ayah, the first one, and it talks about how this messenger was taken from the Masjid al-haram to the Masjid al-Aqsa, and then you read the preceding verses after it, it just jumps talking about Moses and about Noah, and it seems as if you would naturally think, no, it's actually all in the context of that same narrative. But the way that the traditional Islamic narrative wants you to understand it is, no, that first verse is sort of like juxtaposed alone, sort of like put it in its own little bubble, and then forget about it and continue reading from the second ayah onwards. And that's one of the things I think kind of helps me in my mind solve the riddle of Surah 17, is because I actually know if you just look at it as one continuous group of verses, say 1 to 7, then actually it makes a lot more sense if you interpreted it in a different light, namely that the farthest mosque, which seems you point out, it's a very strange way of talking about Jerusalem, because why would you talk about Jerusalem as just the farthest temple, the farthest place of prostration? It seems as if if anything were to be sacred, surely it's Jerusalem, right? Like even the Quran acknowledges it through the use of its selective stories and its landscapes, the importance of that place. So surely that makes better sense for Surah 17, Ayah 1.
Yes. Why would you say the sacred place of worship and then this other place, however you describe the other place? Why would you contrast it? It can't be as sacred as the sacred place of worship. Nothing could ever be that sacred. So why on earth would you say contrast Jerusalem with the sacred place of worship when so much of the Quran is telling stories that impress upon the reader the importance of Jerusalem?
I find
totally appreciate your point of view.
Yeah, well, like I said, I find it very useful in reading your work, because I think that I never saw it that way before, and that really helped me sort of put things together. So anyway, continuing on with your
some more arguments. I can't go through them all. Muhammad, I would say, is a biblical epithet for the temple. It appears twice within the Bible as a word referring to the longed for temple. The Maqam Ibrahim is, I think, something of a giveaway, because the word Maqam, which simply means place, appears 4 times in Genesis chapter 22 to describe where Abraham built the pyre to sacrifice Isaac. So if it's actually using the word Maqam is quite, or Maqam is quite prominent in the Genesis story. The fact that the Quran then takes that very same word is really like, look, this is the place. It's not a coincidence. It's not just a word you happen to pick up. Some point about the Hajj. The Torah refers to 3 Hag pilgrimage feasts that take place at the temple. And the word Hajj is, of course, very similar to Hajj. And also head shaving at the temple, which is mentioned in the Quran, again mentioned in the Bible with the Nazarite oath.
Yep.
Move on. Yes, and this instruction that this instruction to capture the sacred place of prostration, people, or Islam has for so long created this idea that it takes place on a blank canvas in a desert land where news might occasionally seep through of a battle involving the Romans far, far away, but somehow one feels that the narrative of the Quran story of Muhammad preaching in the Kaaba and then being forced to flee and then regaining control of Mecca, this could easily have taken place 100 or 200 years earlier, or 100 or 200 years later, and the basic facts wouldn't have changed very much. One has the sense that this takes place on an abstract plane, far removed from the rest of the world. But that's not the case. The Quran was announced, as far as we can tell, composed in a time of huge importance. This is the time of the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 629, often called the last great war of antiquity. And during that course of that war, the Jews had re-established worship at the Jerusalem temple. The Sasanians had then evicted the Jews from the temple and had committed massacres, so it is said, of the Christian population. And it seems to me this is exactly what would have caused anybody from a Judeo-Christian background living at that time to be thinking about the end of the world, signs of the eschaton now at hand, Gog and Magog trampling into the temple. It seems this is exactly the time that one would expect people to be writing this sort of thing.
Yeah, just to jump in. So from reading your thesis, I get this is a really sort of important center point to it, I think, because you go over the importance of the significance of these dates, of what was going on between the Sassanids and the Byzantium, and how there was this place, there was a group of Jews who were trying to reestablish worship and rebuild a temple in, I think was it 614 or
Yes.
near about that.
Yeah.
And how this would have set the stage for someone, well, for a messenger to be needed to kind of interpret this eschatology, like in end times, and to really give a reason for it, I guess. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
The great apocalypses do seem to come when Jerusalem is under threat. So one thinks of Deuteronomy, Isaiah, or Ezekiel during the Babylonian captivity. One thinks of the book of Daniel during when it's being attacked by the Seleucids. Thinks of Jesus when the Romans are in town and are oppressing the Jews, and Jesus's prophecy of the destruction of the temple there, using his own body as a metaphor. So it seems to me that the fact that the Quran is this great apocalyptic work, preaching that the hour is at hand, and yet it is written at precisely the time that Jerusalem is being attacked and is being ransacked, and temple restoration hopes are being dashed, and yet we are asked to just put that completely out of our minds and just assume that Muhammad was just fighting over some fly-blown little town that no one's ever heard of,
hundreds of miles,
a thousand miles away.
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense to me. And then, of course, Stephen Shoemaker, I mentioned a bit ago, and he, in his book Death of a Prophet, lists all the sources that have Muhammad fighting in Palestine. Muhammad is not completely unknown to history. There were various people who referred to Muhammad within the 7th century, and they all place him in and around Palestine.
Wow.
So how difficult is it to imagine that the man who's talking about capturing the sacred place of worship and fighting to capture Jerusalem might actually be talking about the sacred place of worship as being its term for Jerusalem? How difficult is it to imagine that he was actually fighting to capture the place that he said he was fighting to capture?
Right, and I remember you linked this a little bit with Surah 9. I remember you said that Surah 9, we don't find the Bismillah in the surah. I think it's the only surah that doesn't have the in the name of God at the very beginning, what Muslims call the Bismillah. And I think you gave an understanding as to why that might be. And I think, do you want to talk a little bit about
that? Yes, well, the Quran doesn't really have much of a triumphal conclusion. There are all these jihad verses, all these verses of fighting, where he exhorts people to, exhorts his audience to fight and to show resilience and to show discipline. And then we never really gets the sense of, oh, we've succeeded, we've now achieved our objective. That verse never really seems to come. But Surah 9 does seem to, or the first 40 verses of Surah 9 does contain 3 references to the Islamic community being in possession of the Masjid al-Haram. So one assumes that they had captured it, they had achieved their mission. And I have reasons to think, I won't go into them now, that Muhammad died before the capture of Jerusalem. So it looks to me as though his people, his fighters, managed to capture Jerusalem after his death, and they needed to put something in there to show for posterity that the mission had been a success, that they had captured Jerusalem, which is no mean feat, and yet they do so in Surah 9, and I find it very telling that there's no, as you say, there's no certificate at the beginning to say that this is the words of God. These words, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, that begin every other surah, don't actually appear in Surah 9, which I take as being a possible sign that it was actually composed after Muhammad's death. So a case of Bismillah, no.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that, as you mentioned, we have these we have these scholars who are pointing out that actually we have historical records that say that Muhammad did not die when the standard Islamic narrative says he died, which is 632, but rather he was around at the very least in 634, and he was way further north, attempting to invade Jerusalem. Is amazing. I really find that amazing. It calls into question everything. I feel the whole narrative at that point goes up in the air, and it's a free-for-all to actually trying to figure out exactly what was going on. If you can't get it right about where Muhammad was and when he died and what he was doing, then yeah, we know that it's on faulty foundations, and we need to figure out what the real foundations are.
Yeah, I just brought in the last tier there, and the last tier is what happens after Muhammad's death. And we know that the early conquerors of Jerusalem started doing building works on the Temple Mount almost immediately. It's mentioned by Sophronius, and Sophronius, who's a patriarch of Jerusalem, doesn't live much beyond the conquest by the Arabs. So we know they must have started these building works almost straight away. We have this great monument, the Dome of the Rock, very mysterious. I try not to get too assertive about what I think it means. What it does mean is that this place was very holy to the Arab conquerors, and there's nothing remotely like it in Mecca. It's referred to, Jerusalem is referred to in early Islam, to this day, as Al-Quds, the holy, or the holy house, and you find that the early Arab conquerors mint coins with menorahs on, which is a symbol of Jerusalem, a symbol of the Jerusalem temple.
Yep. Sorry, I think you cut out a little bit there, but it's okay. I think your internet had a little stutter. But carry on.
Okay. So these are really my a summary of my main arguments. So I'd very much encourage anyone who's interested, thinks there might be something in it, to read my article and get in touch with me if you wish to, and let me know what you think.
Awesome stuff. I'll make sure to put a link to your thesis in the video. So the link will be down below in the description. People can click on that and have a look and give it a read for themselves. I found it fascinating. If you happen to be interested in this sort of thing and you really want to look into, I would say alternative Islamic history. I don't think that's really fair. I'm going to say true Islamic history in the sense of coming closer to what actually happened and not just what the myth is, what the legends are, but what really was the case, according to independent eyewitnesses at the very least. And Paul has done an amazing job of putting that in his thesis. And I'm still thinking about things and exactly where my position is. But this has definitely influenced a lot of my thinking. So I would like to say thank you very much, Paul, for being with me today. It's been amazing having you here. I'm going to switch back to this. There we go.
Great. No, thank you very much for having me on. It's always very interesting to chat to somebody about all this, and it's always great to have discussion in the comments afterwards and see what people think and what they have to offer. Many of my leads have come out of discussion threads like this, so it's very good.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed, especially on Mel's stuff, the links in there, people put some really high level stuff, and it's like, wow, there is like a community of people that is very passionate about this, that really want to know what the truth is and really want to dig deeper, which is amazing, and that has been really useful as well. So thank you very much for joining us, Paul, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch. And to everyone watching, have a lovely evening or morning wherever you might be. Take care.
Bye.